and as chair of the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science here at Berkeley, it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to today's inaugural lecture of the Baxter Liberty Initiative, a new program within our department created with the generous support of Ambassador Frank Baxter, who we are fortunate enough to have join us here today. The world around us is bristling with politics, from Tahrir Square to the primaries and caucuses of this year's GOP nominations, all the way to the boardroom of the Regents of the University of California itself. Signs of struggle over the meaning and content of liberty, equality, accountability, diversity, power, the rule of law, and the like abound everywhere. And of course, politics is no stranger to Berkeley, and this fervor of our times is abundant on our campus, where political science, I'm proud to note, is the largest undergraduate major in the college, and where the Travers Department continues to rank as one of the very finest places anywhere in the world to engage critically and openly in the study of politics. Today's inaugural event in the Baxter Liberty Initiative is in that very best tradition of political science at Berkeley. Without further ado, then, let me introduce my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Professor Jack Citron. Jack is Heller Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institute of Governmental Studies. He has been a fixture here at Berkeley for nearly as long as I've been alive, and for both our sakes, I will not attach any dates to Jack's career here at Berkeley. His scholarship ranges across a truly impressive spectrum of topics, from the politics of the initiative process and trust in government to immigration, multiculturalism, and American national identity. Most importantly, for the present moment, Jack has been one of the leading drivers in shaping the Baxter Liberty Initiative at Berkeley, and so he will lead us through this afternoon's program. On that note, I'm delighted to hand off the ceremonies to Jack Citron. Jack.
I'm glad you didn't mention the age factor because I immediately made a mistake with this minus, so I'll try and accommodate to that error. Anyway, it's a privilege for me to be part of this Baxter Liberty Initiative. And in addition to welcoming the audience, I'd like to welcome especially Ambassador Baxter, Chancellor Bergeneau, Mrs. Bergeneau, and our Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, George Breslauer, and Dean Carla Hesse of Social Sciences. And Carla, together with Frank, conceived and created this initiative and should get, all the credit for making it happen. Let me, in the capacity of MC, just first talk about the format, how we're going to proceed, and then make a more formal introduction of Ambassador Baxter. So we are privileged to have as the inaugural speaker Professor Richard Epstein, whom I also will introduce in detail later. And the format will be after Frank says a few welcoming remarks. Professor Epstein will speak, give a lecture. Then Professor Cooter of the Berkeley School of Law will respond. And after that, we will have a Q&A period. You've each been handed a card which will be collected if you have a question, and I will pose the questions to Professors Epstein and Cooter, and they will respond. I should say that there'll be a reception after the event outside in the atrium, and also Professor Epstein's latest book is on display there and available, and for anyone who wishes a personal copy. So let me now begin with the introduction of Ambassador Baxter. Frank Baxter is a native of Northern California from Auburn. He graduated from UC Berkeley with a BA degree in economics with honors in 1961. And before college, he enlisted and served in the Air Force for 4 years. From 1974 until 2002, he was employed by Jeffries & Company, a global investment bank, where he served in a number of capacities. In 1987, he became CEO of the company and retired in 2001, but serves as chairman emeritus of the firm. In addition, from 2006 to 2009, he was the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the Oriental Republic of Uruguay. Ambassador Baxter's civic activities are many and varied. He's committed to youth, to education and the arts, dedicating his time and energy on many boards. And in addition, he served on Governor Schwarzenegger's Commission for Jobs and Economic Growth. In the context of the campus here, he has been a trustee of the University of Berkeley Foundation and has demonstrated his deep commitment to the university in many ways. He served as the foundation trustee from 1998 to 2003, and again from 2005 to 2006, serving as chair from 2003 to 2005. Currently, he is vice chair of the board and chair of its executive committee, an impressive amount of commitment to our campus for which we are grateful. On a personal note, Ambassador Baxter has been married to his wife, Kathy, for 44 years, and serendipitously, Kathy Baxter and I went to high school together in Tokyo at the American School in Japan there, so it was a kind of a happy reunion when I first met Frank. They have 3 children, 6 great-grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And Frank, I'd like to ask you to come up and say a few words.
Thank you very much, Jack. It's has been great to know you, and it's wonderful to be here. My memories as a student of Berkeley are certainly life-defining, as they are, I think, with every student. But to recognize what a tremendous institution that we're a part of has become more to me recently when I've been more involved with the foundation. And I'd like to say that as the university is adapting to the new economic reality, is just amazing. They're adapting for the better under the leadership of Chancellor Virginow and his leadership team here. It's really something. Reality is an acquired taste, and these gentlemen have acquired reality. I can assure you of that. And I think it's important. I've heard that the ship of Berkeley sometimes lifts a little bit port side, and I thought that it might be beneficial to kind of add to the intellectual diversity. So that's why I'm underwriting this series, which will have a speaker like Richard Epstein for the next 3 years, and I hope from there on, so that we can just have an exchange of ideas. And I saw a quote from David Hume that really kind of fits what I'm looking for. It was in his essay on liberty. He say, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." So I'm so happy to have us all hear Richard's side of the case. Thanks.
Well, after lunching with Richard today, I'm convinced that he knows everything about everything. And so let me give a more formal introduction. Richard Epstein is the inaugural Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of Law at the new NYU School of Law. Prior to his joining the faculty, he was a visiting law professor at NYU from 2007 through 2009. And he, of course, is perhaps better known as a professor, as a James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law Emeritus and a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago, where he was for many years. He also serves as the Peter and Kirsten Bedford Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he's been since 2000. Professor Epstein researches and writes in a broad range of constitutional, economic, historical, and philosophical subjects. He has published 15 books. His most recent one, which is on display outside, Design for Liberty, Private Property, Public Administration, and the Rule of Law, was published by Harvard University Press in 2011. In 2011, he was a recipient of the Bradley Prize for Outstanding Achievement. In 2005, the College of William and Mary School of Law awarded him the Brigham Cantor Property Rights Prize. Among his many, many activities, Professor Epstein writes weekly columns for Forbes.com and the Hoover Institution's Defining Ideas Journal. It's a real privilege to have Richard Epstein inaugurate the Baxter Liberty Initiative lecture series.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Well, it's very nice to know that I'm a form of intellectual ballast, whose job is to balance the ship. Before I begin to talk about the lecture, I'd just like to say a few words of my own, and thanks to Frank Baxter, who's a longtime friend of 4 Hours, I would say. We did have lunch together. I think we hit it off, and as he sort of represents to me the model of what we would always wish to have and expect in our best civic and public servants: excellence in business and a deep commitment with respect to voluntary and charitable activities of an educational type, and also, in his particular case, an intense devotion for trying to figure out how it is that you can bring new management skills and models of business in order to renovate public school systems for the benefit of inner city children who have always subject the short end of the stick. And in fact, one of the things that he said, which I think struck me, is there is a conventional wisdom out there which indicates that when you're trying to deal with educational work, you better get them early or you will, quote unquote, never get them at all. And Frank says with the set of programs that he has using new technologies and old love and care, you are in fact able to make major changes even with students further along in the educational profile, and at least for the long-term well-being of this country, to the extent that initiatives, be they public or private, that can transform the educational system, I think represent perhaps the most important investment that we can make in the future of a nation. So I'm very much by that. And indeed, I have to say I've spent my entire life in education at a different end of the spectrum. Never much had discipline problems. I've had a lot of problems with disbelief in some of the things that I've said and some of the things that I believe in, but those never trouble me because I think it's really a part of the essential debate. And what Professor Tse said is something that I'd like to comment on, because everybody seems to begin a lecture with two elements. One of them has to do with the dismal state of current affairs in the United States in terms of the long-term projections that growth and recovery are down, and that if we try to examine what's going to be the position of our children a generation from now, the consensus opinion seems to be that things will be worse off than they were today. And the question is, what, if anything, can we do about this? And the second thing I want to do is, it turns out there seems to be a Humean revival about the premises. I've always been a great devotee of Hume, particularly the books on ethics. And the Dean, Carl Hesse, is a devotee of Hume, and it turns out Frank Baxter is, and it turns out that I am. And so the question of which Humean phase do you want to do? If this were a short lecture and I was supposed to sit down, I think I would start with the famous quote from Hume, which says, when you face the intractable problems of the world, carelessness and inattention sometimes afford you the only solutions, and then disappear from the platform. But since that's not my obligation today, and I have to sing, as it were, for my supper, which will come afterwards, or at least the reception, I'm going to quote another thing, which is the stress that our friend Hume gave with respect to settled expectations as a way of trying to organize and to put a society together. And so what I'm going to do is to talk about that in connection with this particular title, which is, what is the title of this lecture anyhow? But it has something to do with change and stability and so forth. And so what I'm going to do is to talk about classical liberalism in good time and bad. And as I thought about it, I decided I didn't like the title as much as I thought I would. Now that I've written the lecture, yes, I did write the lecture. And what I'm going to do is to talk in part about the question of how it is that we need to deal with the, as it were, a system of settled expectations in good times and bad, particularly with respect to government relations and individuals. But I've also concluded that it's a more complete and more accurate lecture if what I add to the mix is the following, which is a sense of what it is that we want in terms of the settled expectations to be, so that it's not just a question of having constancy across time, but it's also putting into place the large sort of generic rules in the way in which we organize a large structure. So let me sort of begin with the following abstract proposition about what I think is the greatest problem of governance, and then the way in which I think you have to try to attack it. The base problem of governance is its greatest virtue, which is the question of how it is that you handle and use discretion in the face of uncertainty in the world's affairs. And to some extent, it's impossible to imagine that you could run, for example, a chief executive officer, say that the President of the United States has no discretion whatsoever in which ambassadors to admit, whether to declare war, what legislation to put before Congress, and all the rest of that kind of stuff, so that discretion is essentially inherent in executive authority. And if it's going to be inherent in executive authority, it's going to even be more apparent when you start to deal with various kinds of legislative authority. So what you then do is you say, okay, we would like to have a lovely amount of excessive discretion at the highest level of government so that good people can do the right thing. But to go back to another political philosopher of no mean standing, our good friend James Madison told us that enlightened statesmen will not necessarily be always at the helm. And so what you have to do is to build a ship which is not only good enough to give discretion to the folks whom you like, but also to try to constrain the discretion if it turns out that the wrong set of people get themselves into power. The question then comes, how do you want to organize that mix? Because there's no safe platform. If you're going to cut down discretion for good guys, you're going to cut it down for bad guys, which we like. But au contraire, if you cut it down for bad guys, you cut it down for good guys. So the question then is, which kinds of rules do you think, or which kinds of areas do you think are amenable to stable expectations which will improve matters? And the reason why this is so important is that if you look at the correlative side, every time you give greater discretion to public authorities to do what they ought, you now create greater burdens on private parties to see how it is that they must anticipate and adapt to what it is that these government officials could do. This is a costly kind of venture, so that in equilibrium, if it turns out that you push much too hard on the discretion on the public side, it will have a very adverse effect on the way in which settled expectations can work in the private side, which is, of course, the Humean area. So for my two examples of the general proposition, what I'm going to do is to talk first a little bit about fiscal policy and taxation, and then talk a little bit about monetary policy. And I picked these things because they're areas in which I have no particular specialized training, but which nonetheless I think can be illuminated by the way in which you apply this sort of general maxim about the question of give discretion when you need it, don't give it when you don't. And so when it comes to the issue of taxation, for example, what is very clear is that it is impossible to write in constitutional form a rule of the sort which says that the tax burdens in the United States shall be X dollars for this, that, and the other year. We have put positions like that into the Constitution. For those of you who don't know the Seventh Amendment, the lucky ones amongst you, when it starts to talk about the right to jury trials at common law, it says for trials that are a minimum of $20. Somehow or other that limitation doesn't seem to be particularly useful today. But if you're talking about taxation, the key features that you have to worry about are structure and duration. And if it turns out that you create a system which is weak with respect to both of these issues, then it means that the correlative obligation that is going to be cast upon private bodies to project what these particular figures will in fact create a serious retardation with respect to the level and confidence in the type of investments that you're going to start to make. What you need to do, therefore, is to figure out first how you structure rates and then how you structure durability. The modern progressive tradition on this issue is very good, very clear. I didn't say it's very good. You didn't hear that. What I meant, in effect, to say is that no matter how progressive it is, there's at least an argument by certain people that it's not quite progressive enough. And so that what you do is in times when you think you need revenues, you make it more steep, and then when it turns out to be relaxation, you don't go back to a flatter level. For the past 30 or 40 years, I've always been very much a Humean and a Lockean on the point that the flat tax is, in fact, the dominant way to go, that it's a preferable tax to put on consumption rather than on income, because if you put it on income, you create a very unhappy disjunction between the taxation of ordinary income and capital gains, which have very different properties. With consumption, you don't have to face that situation. And so at this particular point, what happens is, if you have this particular flat structure and you have it on consumption, you need to get some relatively simple devices which will tell you how it is that you could distinguish income that's going to be spent from that which is not, and you kind of create an omnibus Keogh plan to put stuff in that you don't wish to be subject to tax, and you tax all the remainder that's left outside. And if, in fact, you do that, you can reach whatever revenue target the government needs to satisfy by simply raising and lowering in tandem the taxes on all individuals. And what that does, in effect, is it reduces the level of political uncertainty associated with taxation, because what public choice theory teaches us on this particular dimension is that not only does one compete in order to attract assets, but one also competes in order to shuck off liabilities on other individuals, so that when people reach their tax nirvana, given their own self-interest, a system in which I get all the benefits and you bear all the costs is one which I think is perfectly divine. The problem is it does not generalize, because we cannot all be in the preferred position, and therefore we spend and waste resources on trying to produce our relative position without getting any form of concomitant gain. And so long as you know that you can meet the revenue targets, you would like to be able to silence the confusion and also to reduce the level of political uncertainty. I might also add that if you spend a lot of time, as I have, trying to figure out how you administer a tax system with income division, capital gains, partnerships, and so forth, you realize that the drag that you have in trying to make sure that the progressive tax is not evaded is in fact a very steep and very costly one, and that if you ran to another system, you would be able to expand the pie. And the Epstein first rule on approximation is that if you have an open set of institutions, there's no way that the rich can co-opt all the gains for themselves. In fact, if you spent your time studying the pattern associated with various kinds of public expenditures, it turns out that if you have a uniform tax, there's massive redistribution in favor of those people who are less fortunate than others in the way in which the benefits are provided. So if you want to think, for example, about the greatest advances in the past century or so, it's clearly in the area of public health. And what happens is these things get introduced as benefits for the privileged, but to the extent that they're shared goods financed out of dollars from taxation and so forth, most of the benefit goes to those people at the bottom end of the distribution. And you can check that out if you care by looking at the way in which there's a compression in life expectancy, the difference between being in the top quartile and the bottom quartile on a matter of this sort is really much smaller than it is today than it was. And if you want to get a measure of racial progress in the United States, the cold numbers are these. If you go back to 1900, you would find white life expectancy at about 47 or 48, black life expectancy at 32. If you do it today, it turns out there's a 3 or 4 year difference between the two groups, and it's narrowing at the rate of about a month per year, so that fairly soon you'll have pretty close to parity, at least for those people who reached age 30, or when the criminal stuff and the deaths through God knows what are removed from the situation. This is an amazing achievement that one is able to accommodate, and it can be accommodated in effect without having explicit transfer payments between one group and another. The transfer payments, for what it is worth, have had relatively little effect on life expectancy. In fact, if you were to take the largest of these programs, Medicare, what you discover essentially is that the increase in life expectancy attributable to these programs is as close to zero as you could measure through statistical purposes. In fact, the only increases that you see in these particular areas are increase of maybe 4 years in the last 45 years with respect to the program in place, and most of that is attributable to other factors, which if I had time, I would identify in greater fullness. So one of the things that you have to do is to remember the following. If you really understand the way in which you can get taxation to be stabilized, not only do you get long-term growth, but it turns out that you get, in consequence, relatively favorable distributionable consequences without pushing yourself very hard in the favor of conscious programs of redistribution from A to B. The second major thing that one worries about with respect to the operation of a tax system turns out to be its durability. How long is it going to be kept in one form or another? One of the reasons why we've had such a sluggish recovery in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years is that starting in the mid part of the last decade, it turns out that virtually every tax rate that you have in the Internal Revenue Code is a short-term tax rate with no long-term stability. So you have the question of will you or will you not have an estate tax, and how long will it be? Will you or will you not have a dividends tax, and how high will it be? Will you or will you not have a corporate tax, and how high will that be? How much progressivity will you add to the income tax? What's the slope of the gain, and so forth? Every time you create that kind of uncertainty, the complementary obligation on private individuals is going to be increased, and the basic notion that people invest with respect to the short-term perspective only is completely wrong. And so if you give them a random variable instead of a number going forward in time with respect to structure, again, the negative effects on wealth will be very powerful. And given the fact that they're going to be powerful, you can be assured that the distributional consequences that you get from steep progressivity will not in any sense of the word offset the dislocation. The basic fundamental truth about the United States and its current tax structure is, in effect, that we are now in periods in which the expected rate of growth for the foreseeable future in this particular country is lower than the expected population increase in the country through natural birth on the one hand and immigration on the other. The clear implication is a slow decline in the standard of living that no programs of redistribution can stop, but which they can clearly aggravate. And one must be able to reverse that. The same problem is true with respect to discretion when you start to deal with monetary affairs. And it's extremely important that one understand that if you want to talk about the great intellectual achievements of Milton Friedman, ironically, the two areas in which he did his most important work are not market-related issues. They are having to do with the history of money on the one hand and with the development of the consumption function, that is how people manage to arbitrage differences in consumption and production in their own lifetimes with or without the use of various kinds of market sort of mechanisms through savings and so forth. And essentially it's the same lesson that you have here. If in fact what you do is you have a Fed like the one that we've had for the last 10 years, which thinks that in good times what it ought to do is to put on the brakes and kind of raise the interest rates, and in bad times what it ought to do is to lower the interest rates in order to stimulate this, that, or the other thing, what you're doing is just making two complementary mistakes which don't cancel out. They simply add one to another. And the key insight that one has to have in understanding how it is that these things work together is to realize that the uncertainty in question will, in fact, make, again, all private decisions more difficult to make than would otherwise be the case. Essentially, virtually all major transactions have some cash or price component associated with them. And if, in fact, you have uncertain levels of inflation, what happens is that something which you would like to be a fixed element in private transaction now becomes a variable element in private transaction. That means that private people have to start putting in various kinds of clauses to deal with changes in monetary rates and so forth, which are extremely difficult to hedge or to arbitrage, so that you spend a vast amount of money in every single transaction that takes place in an effort to counteract the kinds of things that governments tend to do. And so what you want to do is to essentially target a uniform rate of inflation, say roughly equivalent to that of productivity gains of 1 to 2% a year, and try very hard to keep that. The moment you decide, oh, no, what we have to do is to keep these rates very, very low so that we could stimulate borrowing, then it turns out that those individuals who rely, for example, in retirement on the dividend income or the interest income from various kinds of stocks and bonds will find that they themselves have been very hurt. There is no way, in other words, in which you can kind of make one of these programs work in such a fashion that by the time that you're done with the exercise that it is, that you have unalloyed gains. What you do is you have uncertainty without particular benefits, and this is true with respect to various kinds of stimulus programs of one or another. I had a long debate about this in the fall about whether or not we were going to have a second recession if we did not pass the Obama jobs bill, and I took the position that the best way to have a second recession was to pass it on the grounds that once again you're introducing levels of government expenditure and extreme forms of trade regulation, which in the short run would do no good because of the uncertainty created. It would destroy private jobs in order to create public ones, and in fact through the long-term restrictions on the way in which foreign capital was invested in the United States would have a terribly depressing effect. So essentially what happens is in these two major areas, what we need to do if we're going to restore ourselves to a position of growth, in my view, is to completely reverse the way in which we've done these things. Now, the rest of the question that we have to face is, okay, this is an argument about discretion. But the next argument we have to have is, what about the underlying rules that we're going to try to introduce in order to deal with the kinds of discretion that is going to be raised? And what I'm going to do here very briefly is to sort of go back to the sort of classic common law model, the one which was embraced by Hume, who was in fact a student of law. He studied it in the Roman variety, which I also teach, but in fact for these purposes the differences between the Roman and the common law systems are relatively model. And I'm going to give you a kind of a side-by-side comparison, historically, some examples old, some examples new, of what happens when you start to deviate from the kinds of principles that Hume transferred in order to deal with those of the regulatory state. In doing this, I will, of course, have to concentrate a good deal on the progressive movement and the New Deal, because there is no question, not only as a matter of constitutional law, but as a matter of political statecraft, it represents a radical disjunction and change in orientation from the more limited government, we worry about faction type of arrangements that existed when Madison wrote Federalist 10 and when the Constitution itself was formed. And so what are the kinds of rules that I want to talk about here? I'm going to strip it down and make it as simple as I possibly can. I'm going to start first with the rules on the acquisition of property. And the common law rule was called occupatio, or occupation, which meant that all kinds of things that were subject to private ownership could in fact be reduced to private ownership by somebody just taking possession of it. And I qualified the words things subject to private ownership to make it clear that even if you go back to Justinian, that large types of property were always thought to be held in common. The sea, the air, the beaches, and so forth. And the reason one wants to do this, I don't want to put myself into this incredible box where you say that private property is the be-all and end-all of everything. A more comprehensive system has to understand and to be able to figure out what the equilibrium is between public and private property. And for these purposes, the areas that tend to remain open access regimes are long and skinny. They're transportation, communication type arrangements, whereas those which are square, which you could then use for production, tend to be reduced to private ownership so that you could have heavy investment on them one way or another. And so the common law rule on this was one of first possession. And what happens is you then have to worry about the allocation of new resources. And the question is whether or not you want to carry that rule or something like it over. And for these purposes, the example that I'll give you is the one that has to deal with the spectrum, because there was a very large debate starting in the early 1920s, carrying itself through basically the judicial resolution on how we deal with the Communications Act of 1934, which indicates how badly astray that you can go when you start to think that administrative processes can do a better job than more or less automatic rules. And in many ways, the mischief maker in a lot of this stuff was none other than our good progressive Republican Herbert Hoover, who oversaw, for example, the passage of the Radio Act of 1926, which set a lot of this stuff into motion. So the early way in which the spectrum was acquired was that people basically occupied and used a little bit of it, and then everybody else had to respect their exclusive control over the frequency, and what you slowly did is to see the frequencies start to fill in one after another. Now, this system is not all that good, particularly if it turns out that you have 1,000 people trying to claim frequency in the same minute. And so another way to do it is for the government to sit there in a non-discretionary way, figure out what the optimal bandwidth is, and then sell that bandwidth off as property rights to all individuals, which they're free to combine on the one hand, to subdivide on the other, to change use, so long as they respect a single constraint. Namely, that there be no interference that go from the activities under one part of the frequency spectrum to the activities that take place under a second portion of the spectrum. And it turns out that you can do this quite simply, and it has enormous advantages that tend to be lost under a regulatory system. For one thing, if you look at the utilization of the spectrum today, you'll discover that the areas that are developed to the cell phone are in fact so intensely used there's basically any room there, and they need more and more technology, whereas those parts of the spectrum which are given to the police and fire departments have barely any use at all. Television spectrum is wildly underutilized and so forth, and it's because what you did was to make a central planning decision type of mistake, which says that we think we know what the relative proportions of uses will be today, and we're going to freeze that in place indefinitely until the government starts to move. This, it turned out, did not work at all. And so what the government then decided to do under these circumstances was to create the following kind of situation. It had an administrative process in which people applied for a frequency, not by bids, but by explaining what they would do with it and why they were qualified to receive it. And I think I could report with complete confidence that nobody is yet to be able to develop the kinds of criteria that you would want to use for this allocation of spectrum. And then the moment that one guy wins, he is now allowed to sell the thing off. So what you do after all is to get an auction, but the only thing that happens now is that the private applicant, rather than the government, gets it after huge waste. So going back to the older rules will work much better. There are serious problems having to do with common pool, overhunting of animals, but those can be solved in a way which in fact do produce social improvements. The initial allocation cannot be done by these kinds of direct administrative means. The second of the great institutions of the social law is in fact the law of contract. And the basic model of contract is, yes, we worry about fraud and duress and incapacity and insanity and infancy and a bunch of stuff like that. But for most able-bodied citizens, the great intuition with respect to contract is you only surrender that which is worth less to you than that which you receive in exchange, so that these exchanges produce mutual gain. And then, to use the words of my great colleague Ronald Coase, the entire object of the legal system is to try to figure out how you reduce the frictions associated with these transactions. The lower the friction, the higher velocity of positive sum games, and you're off to the races. When you read much of the modern critique of contracts, starting with people like John Dewey and so forth, they have exactly the opposite view of what these systems are about. And they start to think that the way in which you know that there's a decent agreement is, in fact, to have bargaining. So they want to increase the transactions cost. They want somebody over the back fence to yield a little bit to his neighbor. And then by dickering, what you will do is get to the optimal contract. If you try to take that to a Walmart line, have 10 people in line, and each of them having 100 things in their basket, and having dicker with respect to the price of each item, you realize that the transactions cost will overtake the gain. So that the other model is much more accurate under these circumstances, and it's a sign of an immature and incomplete and underdeveloped market where, in fact, these frictions slow down the rate of transactions and reverse things. So that the progressive instinct, which says that standardization, in fact, is a sign of trouble, basically attaches the wrong side to an important problem. The correct side to attach to it is standardization matters to improve things vastly. There are still, to be sure, issues about antitrust enforcement, but the key point to understand there is that both competition and monopoly are easier to operate in a world with standardized, fungible, and exchangeable commodities, so you can't figure out which of the two things is better, and therefore what you have to do in order to prove up one for the other is actually to find evidence of collusion, for which there are techniques that I won't talk about here that will do it. So what happens is the modern system then decides to put all these restraints on agreements. It adds to the argument associated with dickering by saying that information and mistake is always rampant in the way in which these transactions are put together. And what you do is you develop huge types of prophylactic and protective rules, all of which are counterproductive. This came to age in the 1930s, and it continued through the 60s and into the present times. What you start to see are first minimum wage, maximum hour laws, overtime laws. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 is one of the great intellectual disasters of our time. If you start looking at the cases, you get all sorts of weird patterns that the courts never understand. So one of my favorite cases involves a bunch of guys who are working overtime, but they sleep on the job because they're on call. And if nobody calls, they sleep, and if somebody calls, they don't. And the way in which the firms arranged the compensation is they gave you a kind of a low base pay when you were sleeping and a high case when you managed to take the call. And when you try to impose a standard overtime arrangement on this, you can't do that. You have to have a uniform average, which completely misses the case. And so what you do, in effect, is you now discover a very important feature about these contractual rules, which is that when people pass them by way of regulating contract, they always look at what the most common pattern turns out to be. But two things happen. One is there's always 15 to 20% of the cases that deviate from the common pattern, and nobody paid any notice to them because there was no need to in a world without regulation. And then it turns out, as the technologies start to evolve, it turns out that innocuous rescissions become extremely dangerous ones. And so one of the things that we have done then, and with more stuff on the labor laws and so forth, is to continue to contract the areas of gain that are associated in dealing with labor transactions, so that our labor markets are now hit with fairly high levels of employment, but nothing compared to what happens when you get virtually life tenure in every job in a system like Greece or Italy, Spain, and maybe even France, where in fact what happens is strong job protection drives you to 20 and 25% unemployment rates, which cannot be a sustainable equilibrium in the long term, and which leads to immense efforts, including violence, with respect to those people who tried to liberalize in the 19th century that system. The last of the things that I'm going to talk about, because I don't have all that much time, actually I'll talk about two more since I have 7 minutes, or one, I don't know how it goes, is there's the tort element which is associated with these things. And if you go back to the classical doctrines and try to figure out what a tort is, it essentially turns out to be the kind of activities that one individual engages in that quote-unquote causes harm to another person. Now, the key feature to understand about a legal system is that if you're trying to operate one and you use that particular formulation, you may think yourself an ardent disciple of John Stuart Mill, who announced the harm principle, but it turns out you have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to the way in which you implement that into the world at large. In order to see why, I'm going to give you a phrase in Latin and then translate it into English to show you the sort of the comparison between the wisdom of the ancients on the one hand and the sort of understanding of neoclassical economics on the other. The Latin phrase is damnum absque injuria, which for those of you who have no idea what it means damnum means harm without injury, i.e. there's certain kinds of harms that will not be actionable. And the modern term, which is even every bit as uninformative, is in effect the term called pecuniary externality. And essentially what it means is a pecuniary externality is regarded as a harm from competition, and a real externality is regarded as a harm from pollution. And those distinctions map exactly into the earlier one. Now, why is it that we have to make these distinctions? Because the harm principle, as it's generally stated, is far too broad to be of any use, because it becomes quite clear in a world of scarcity that any time somebody exercises his quote-unquote natural liberty to do anything, there's going to be somebody else who's going to be disadvantaged in consequence of it. So if you have a legal regime in which the actions by A cause any kind of net loss in utility to B, and B can then block the situation, everybody renders everybody else immobile. And so that creates a situation where everybody is worse off in virtue of the harm principle than they would be otherwise. So what happened in virtually every legal system is that you drop the general maxim and you apply it in particular cases that make you, as a first approximation, into a good libertarian. And so the Latin phrase for this was corpora corpore, by the body, to the body. And it turns out that in the English language, the equivalent is that of trespass, or the direct application of force by one person to another. There are deep and complicated theories of causation that explain how you move from creating the use of force on the one hand to creating traps into which people fall on the other, or poisons and so forth, which I don't want to go into here, which you talk about for a good long time if you're trying to teach law students. But the basic intuition is it's the use of force and its close, basically, analogs that are the sum and substance of the harm in question. The next qualification is, what do you do about fraud? And it turns out that the law of defamation and the law of misinformation under fraud, or negligence or something like that, will cover some of these cases of misinformation. But what is left out from this is all forms of competition on the one hand and all forms of discrimination on the other, at least in competitive markets. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when you start going back to the 1930s, and you hear much of this today, including some of the negotiations between the insurance industry and the administration on Obamacare, is that people now say that competitive injury by a new entrant to a business is in fact an actionable harm because of the risk of ruinous competition, which will drive established incumbents out of the market. And the basic argument is you cannot drive an incumbent out of the market by blowing up his factories. That's going to hurt the opportunities for third persons. But you can drive somebody out of business and should be able to drive somebody out of business if you offer them a better product at a lower price than the incumbent. And at that particular point, what you'll do is you'll get a virtuous circle in which, in order to keep those clients, everybody will try to find a better mix of price and services and to sell them to people. And under those particular situations, you get a competitive equilibrium, which essentially gets you to the top of the distribution in terms of both distributional consequences on the one hand and production consequences on the other. The moment you start to do it in the other way and start talking about ruinous competition, the end result, which was the end result of every major New Deal initiative, is in fact the creation of a cartel of one form or another. So to just take the agricultural case, if you decide in effect that it's ruinous competition for one farmer to try to undersell another with wheat, what you do is you establish the Agricultural Production Board of the United States, you generate quotas, people can only produce up to a certain amount, and it becomes essentially a crime or a real civil wrong for anybody to try to produce more than their allocated quota. It was exactly that scheme which led to the adoption of the decision in Wickett v. Filburn, the Great Commerce Clause case, which is now at issue with Obamacare, in which the federal government was given extensive power over commerce in order to supervise and to maintain cartels. So this particular definition of harm that you get wrong has huge consequences for federalism and for the structure of the United States. Nobody but nobody would ever have decided to give this expanded view if you thought, and thought incorrectly, that nobody would do this if you thought and thought incorrectly, that you would not do it if you thought that competition was in fact the appropriate method. At that point, you do not need the federal control except to keep the interstate lines open, because those turn out to be network industries. And similarly, when you're dealing in competitive markets, we have a huge amount of prohibitions against discrimination on the grounds of race, sex, so forth. And the major short-term effect of these distinctions, if you go back historically, was to block all affirmative action programs in the United States in the mid-1960s when they were desperately needed, because we had adopted a colorblind principle. By the time we got rid of colorblindness unambiguously some 15 years later, it wasn't sure that we knew what to do with respect to racial policy. This is a classic illustration where private adaptation would in fact outperform the government. There might be one or two or three firms that would be just terrible on this discrimination stuff, but the increased opportunities that take place everywhere else would more than offset it. Now, the last of the principles that I'm going to talk about, and then I will stop, is the following question. I'll just talk about private law. What do you do in the case of uncertainty when you're not quite sure whether a harm is going to exist? And for these purposes, I'm not going to talk about all the harms like discrimination and competition, but confine myself to physical injury of one form or another. And what you discover in these cases is that the common law basically had it right. And what it said is, we give damages when the moment you cross that line, and we don't ask the question of why you did it. But if you haven't done anything, we're not going to enjoin you unless the harm is repetitive or imminent. So you go ahead and do as much as you want, but you've got to understand that you get yourself in trouble. We're going to show no mercy, no excuses, no nothing. What happens is, as we move into the public sphere, we switch this thing around. And what we do is we go from a system of injunctions to a system of permits. And the two major areas in which this has had its greatest adverse effects have been environmental law on the one hand and food and drug law on the other. In both of these cases, what you do is create vast bureaucracies, and what their job is to do is to slow everybody down until they are certain that no harm above an appreciable level will take place. What this does is to underestimate the true cost of error by simply assuming that the only thing you really have to worry about is the harm that's likely to occur and not the benefits that are likely to occur. And so to give you but my favorite example on the biological side is that in a world in which there was no FDA operative, it took about 2.5 to 3 years to take insulin, which was a crazy idea by a pair of lunatic scientists, and to convert it into a purified drug that saved thousands upon thousands of lives, and did so at the cost of 10 people who died, who would have died anyhow. Somebody seems to be spooky, so I'm going to have to stop. If you tried to do that same thing today, it would take you 10 or 15 years to get the same kinds of things through. Hello? I mean, you can't get that thing off. All right. And so what you have to understand in the way in which you work about this stuff, and the same thing is true with environmental funds, is that when you assume that one kind of error dominates the other, what you're going to do is to create terrible kinds of social losses. And one of the clear signs of the last sort of reformist movement, starting in 1962 with drugs and in 1970 with the EPA, has to get that balance wrong. So summing it all up, when you start to figure out what the right principles are, it's not only that you need certainty and certitude, you also have to be able to make sure that you have rules of property that are quick and easy to apply, rules of contract which remove from the courts the decisions, for the most part, on how it is that you make these things, and just simply let them rip. And when you start to deal with harms, to confine them relatively narrowly and to be very careful about anticipatory relief. And my view is if you were to reverse the major social consensus on all of these issues, you would do vastly better in the way in which you put a political society together today than we've done under a paradigm which has repeatedly rejected these kinds of ideas and has brought us to the impasse that we now face. Thank you.